A lawsuit against UNC Chapel Hill challenges the way the university uses affirmative action in undergraduate admissions. A group called Students for Fair Admissions argues that UNC uses race illegally. The process gives preference to Black and Hispanic students over white and Asian American students. Watching this case with a great degree of interest is Kenny Xu. He is a commentary writer and author of a forthcoming book about similar discrimination cases involving Ivy League schools. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Mitch.
So your expertise on this topic is not in the UNC case, but before we get into the cases you've looked into, what's happening now on the Chapel Hill campus has some similarities to what took place at Ivy League schools?
That's a good question. What you need to know about the UNC Chapel Hill admissions case is that it's being sponsored. The plaintiffs are the same organization that are sponsoring the Harvard case. So the nationally known Harvard case where Students for Fair Admissions sued Harvard University for discriminating against Asian Americans. They're bringing the same lawsuit to UNC Chapel Hill, which has adopted the same or similar race-conscious admissions policy that they're accusing UNC of discriminating against Asian Americans.
Okay, so there are some similarities. Now let's get into the area that you have spent a lot of time researching and are putting together in book form. Tell us how you first got involved with this case of the Ivy League discrimination.
Sure, absolutely. You know, I was raised in a highly educated community when I was young, and I was raised in Princeton, New Jersey. Everybody around me wanted to go to Ivy League colleges. So obviously people viewed college admissions with a certain level of interest. And it was always very obvious to the Asian American community that Ivy Leagues discriminating required them to achieve higher levels on standardized test scores and grades in order to get any traction with them whatsoever. It was always obvious, but when the case captured the national attention, I think in 2018, when the U.S. District Court took up the case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, that's when I started to think about the larger consequences of the diversity ideology that is being used by these schools to advance a system where they can legally discriminate against a certain minority group.
And basically the argument, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the basic argument is if we had a colorblind system, these admissions offices would admit more Asian American students in, and the system that they use keeps Asian Americans out to the extent that they're trying to bring in more other types of minority students.
Yes, that's a good point. There's a framework of theory now, especially among you would call it the educational crowd, that is starting to suggest that Asian Americans are not people of color for the purposes of policy. In that sense, Blacks and Hispanics are the people that are victimized, that need to be given preferences, and whites and Asians are the ones who should have to make those trade-offs. Now, Harvard's policy saying that there is no, which actually it's funny, the district court agreed with, which said that there is no race-neutral workaround to increase its diversity in its populace. I would challenge that because I would give the example of the University of California system. Under Proposition 209, which bans race preferences, which actually was just recently in the 2020 election reaffirmed despite a popular challenge, actually the UC system is one of the most diverse in the nation, has one of the largest concentration of Latinos, largest concentration of Blacks, largest concentration of Asians as well, and they ban race preferences. Yeah.
We're speaking with Kenny Xu, who is a commentary writer and author of a forthcoming book about discrimination cases involving Ivy League schools. Before this Harvard case reached national prominence, do you think many people outside of the Asian American community who were the victims of this or who were the targets of this policy, did they realize this? I mean, most times you hear about affirmative action, you think, okay, whites discriminated against blacks for years and years. This is a way to help deal with that. Asian Americans, I think, for most people, probably weren't even part of their calculation.
Right. And I think in terms of Asian Americans in politics, Asian Americans have never achieved the level of political, you could call it charisma or success, that other minority groups have. I think that is only starting to change, but the groundwork for that is being laid out and with this case. But I would say that an example to use of another minority being targeted historically through affirmative action policies are Jewish Americans, because Harvard has a history of exclusion, not just against Asians, but also against Jewish Americans. In the 1920s, when Jewish Americans started to really come and apply to these top schools, Harvard enacted a policy where they would judge people on their so-called character and their so-called personality, and determine that Jewish Americans did not have the so-called leadership traits that would enable them to become a Harvard man. And so they limited Jewish applicants even back then, and they're doing the same thing with Asian applicants today.
You mentioned this earlier, but let's get into a little bit more of the detail. So an Asian American student wants to apply to an Ivy League school, or in the case of this suit in North Carolina, wants to apply to UNC Chapel Hill. The student has great grades, great test scores. Those in and of themselves don't get the students in the door. They have to do more.
Yes. When you're applying to a school like Harvard, and Harvard will make the case. Harvard will say, we have so many extremely meritorious applicants that we can't possibly accept everybody who comes in, even if they have perfect grades and perfect SAT scores. So we have to look at the holistic character of the individual. And the argument of Students for Fair Admissions is not so much that that grades and test scores are entirely determinant of a person's personality, but that subjective criteria that Harvard uses to determine holistic admissions, things like a personality score. Harvard really pushes the idea of a personality score. In fact, according to one analysis, the use of a so-called personality score, which is determined through qualities like leadership, humor, those kinds of things, is the most determinant factor in admissions to Harvard when you reach a certain decile of academic success. That personality score, Students for Fair Admissions is arguing, is where the Asian discrimination comes in, through those ugly stereotypes of Asian Americans as humorless, as unlikable, as unpersonable, despite no evidence to the contrary.
So a lot of people who are listening to us will have read about this case in the paper. What sorts of things are they going to find in your book that will help flesh out this story?
That's a good question. I think you're going to find a couple of things. You're going to find psychologically what happens when race preferences is widely known and ingrained within a certain community. So when Asian Americans know, and as we have for over 20 years, it's an open secret that Harvard and elite colleges and even places like UNC, which is an elite Ivy, kind of a public Ivy, would do these kinds of policies against them. It affects us psychologically. It affects the way we look at ourselves. It makes us say, okay, well, maybe this isn't the society of the American dream that our parents came and immigrated to this country to live at. The idea that you should be treated on the basis of the content of your character, not the color of your skin, that ideal is in danger. So I investigate a lot of the long-lasting consequences of the left's diversity ideology in our culture.
And what do you hope comes out of all of these suits? There's the Harvard suit, the UNC suit, perhaps others in the future if other schools are engaging in the same sort of thing. What do you hope is the ultimate outcome?
I think it should, at the very least, give us pause about the racial narratives that we are enacting upon ourselves today as a culture. I think there is this idea that if you are white, you're privileged. If you're black, you're oppressed in this country. And there's a systematic narrative. But what are you going to do with Asian Americans, right? Because Asian Americans are not white people, although the left is starting to move in that direction in terms of labeling them that way. But Asian Americans are not white people. They have vastly different experiences. A lot of them came to this country with no money. And yet they have been able to achieve a modicum of academic and socioeconomic success that people would traditionally attribute to white people. So what are you going to do with this inconvenient minority, so to speak? I think that it should serve, that these cases should serve as a pause on the racial narratives that are being enacted upon today.